Hello everybody and welcome to All Backed Up, a video game SOS, the weekly podcast where our intrepid hosts talk about games from their video game backlog. Except for this week, instead of hosts plural, it is hosts singular. It's just me, Mark, talking about my video game backlog this week, and I'm actually cheated a little bit as well. I haven't played a huge amount from my video game backlog, but I did have some time off over the Easter break, and I played some, I guess we'll call them backlog throwbacks, some games that I haven't played in a very, very, very long time that you can do quite an interesting compare and contrast with. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the classic PC first-person shooter Half-Life and its expansion, Half-Life Opposing Force, because I recently played through them both for the umpteenth time, but I haven't played either of them in a few years now. So what really strikes me about Half-Life, and the reason that I felt I could actually just quickly whip out this solo record, is there are some really interesting things you can say about the use of level design as space that makes sense, and then in both Half-Life and its expansion, how you can compare the two. So Half-Life obviously was hugely influential for telling this kind of contiguous tale from start to finish through this space with no cutscenes and no teleportations, barring one or two kind of cheat bits, I guess, but you always keep the same perspective. And so it allows the environment and just being in the world and like the space, quote unquote, to do an awful lot of the heavy lifting of the storytelling. You don't need a cutscene to tell you how destroyed the Black Mesa research facility is by the experiments in the test lab, because as you move through the facility, you see it as it is destroyed. And obviously that was hugely influential at the time. And it holds up. That's kind of the thing about it, I guess, that I will say, is that it still holds up. The effect that Half-Life tries to present by giving you this space and actually first making you spend some amount of time, from 5 minutes to half an hour, depending on how thoroughly you want to explore it, and push and pull at all the different things you can touch. It lets you explore this functioning Black Mesa research facility. To people just going about their day, and then the resonance cascade occurs and everything gets fucked up, and you move back through that space and you start to see how smashed up everything is and broken, and it's invaded by aliens, and it's a pattern that then continues throughout the length of the game as you see this facility, more and more and more of it's destroyed. What's really cool as well about this is it's not just, I guess, because I'm in a few minutes when I talk about Opposing Force, I'm actually going to contradict myself here, but what's cool about this is it's not just offices and basic labs. Because you're in sort of the advanced research area, you get these huge spaces with machinery that doesn't really make too much sense, but you can kind of just go, it's research, quote unquote, and hand wave away some of the logic behind it. That means that Half-Life, the original Half-Life made by Valve, does this really interesting thing where it strings together all these interesting locations and you move from one to the next really naturally. But when you actually try and think about those locations in terms of this being a huge underground facility for government science research, it's kind of preposterous. These huge rivers of toxic waste and underground vent shafts that seem to extend infinitely above and below you, and just odd bits of architectural design like that make it seem very, very fanciful, but then you still get to progress linearly through it, so the whole thing feels like a contiguous space, and that's a really, really cool effect. But what it does do, and this is something, again, that Opposing Force doesn't do, and I thought the thing that was interesting, if you want to talk about it, is it can do a lot of things with its level where you move into an area and you get 3 or 4 different ways to go, and if you're, and there's one way that you have to go, and if you're lucky, the other routes will all get you to some items, some ammo, or some armor, or some health. And that's quite a nice way to move through these areas. You know, if you go into an office area and there's the one route through the offices that gets you out of it, but then if you check the side offices and you check the vents, you can get into extra little areas, bespoke bits off the side where you can get new equipment, which is cool. But it's the fact that most times you encounter these branching areas, you usually get explorative dead end that doesn't really serve any purpose. And you find this in a few different spots throughout the game. There's a bit in, especially early, as well, an office complex, and we've got hostiles, two very early chapters in the game, chapters 3 and 4, chapters 3 and 4. You find that there are routes that you'll take that just seem to end, and they'll also branch, and that'll just end, and you'll find that you can get stuck trying to work out how to go in this branch, and really you need to come all the way back several branches to get to the right way forward. So sometimes this kind of big contiguous space and the way it tries to join it all together can be kind of a hindrance to it. And so I guess that's why I wanted to talk about Opposing Force in contrast to it. And also, I guess I played Opposing Force because I wanted to, but it works as a sort of academic comparison, because Opposing Force developed 2 years later, 18 months later, that sort of time frame, produced by Gearbox, so not even made by Valve, tells a significantly different story. You're one of the Marines being sent in to the base. You arrive after everything's gone bad. You sort of arrive somewhere in like the halfway point or so between like of the original campaign. That's kind of when you get into Opposing Force. So it's or you get into Black Mesa in Opposing Force. So shit's already fucked up, to quote Warren Zevon. And you move through Black Mesa again, same thing. You move through offices and research areas, and you go to Zen for a bit and you come back. But what Opposing Force does that is really, really interesting is it focuses down its explorative gameplay into much tighter loops that feel like they make more sense within the perspective of Black Mesa. I guess what I'm trying to say is the thing that Gearbox very, very smartly took from Half-Life was not fighting soldiers and aliens and having cool guns. It was moving through and within a space, quote unquote, that makes sense. And so it actually steps back a bit from some of the more fanciful environments that Half-Life lent on. As I guess in Half-Life, again, you're in these research labs, so it can kind of justify and handwave away a lot of, again, like the really fanciful environments. Opposing Force steps back quite far from that. It tries to keep you in more realistic environments, and then instead of branching out lots of different forks and then you have to just pick the right one to move on, Opposing Force has a lot of loops. So you'll enter an area and there'll be 4 ways to go, and one of them's the right way to go, and the other three will take you off and around and back into the area you're in. And what it does is, not only does it tighten up that exploration, because you lose that time you spend just wandering back and forth inside vents looking for the right way out, but also it makes the entire space feel so much more realised. When you go off and explore in Opposing Force, you're likely to find like some sort of ammo stash and a route back into another office that allows you to open a door that was locked from the other side, and it's almost like that Dark Souls thing where you'll unlock ladders back into areas and that kind of shit. Like it on obviously on an exponentially smaller scale, but it has this really cool effect of the Opposing Force levels feeling so much more like fully realised spaces, especially because it does try to get away from these sort of endless shafts into nothingness in both directions and that kind of thing where it can. And it tries to use things that feel more like real spaces, more like real office blocks that actually make sense, that kind of thing. And it's super, super cool. I mean, obviously, I think on the whole, Opposing Forces level design is different. It's exciting because it is so different to Half-Life. It tries for different, more interesting, quote unquote, again, environments. I don't necessarily want to say like the environments in Half-Life are not interesting. They are wicked as hell, but that Opposing Force allows itself, because Half-Life has established Black Mesa, Opposing Force can just be like, well, why don't we go to the marine biology testing labs, and you get the whole Crush Depth chapter where you have all the tanks full of ichthyosaurs and the dudes in the full body hazmat suits, and then you have like the one following that, Vicarious Realities, where you're inside all the biology testing domes, and you can see where they're building slices of Zen within Black Mesa, and that stuff's really, really cool. And Half-Life doesn't have areas like that because Half-Life is trying to establish Black Mesa as well as tell a story within it. And there's nothing wrong with that. Obviously, the areas in Half-Life are cool as fuck, and Surface Tension as a chapter, the way you move through Surface Tension, the shit you do in Surface Tension is awesome. It's like Surface Tension into Forget About Freeman is just absolutely impeccable level design. Moving through that surface area, fighting those Marines is really, really cool. So I don't know. I guess I don't really have a point. I don't really necessarily know which one's better. I'd say Half-Life obviously is considerably more influential, and Half-Life has a like I said, it does have a more wild sense to its level designs. It's certainly coming more from the Doom. It's like it's looking at Doom and Quake and saying, how can we take environments like this and strap them together? And then Opposing Forces thinking, okay, well, how do you take environments like that and make them look real? I guess is kind of the way you could say it. Either way, both very cool games. And it turns out if you know how to play them, you can just rush through them super quick. Yeah, we had to do a quick solo episode, and I had some thoughts on Half-Life. So, yeah, thanks for listening to my very, very brief comparison of the level design ethos between Half-Life and Half-Life Opposing Force. Thanks very much. Find us on SoundCloud and YouTube. Bye.